What a lot of people have probably seen, these protests that are happening in Israel over a judicial overhaul. And we are very, very honored to bring back to the show David Sheen, who is an independent on the ground investigative journalist there in Israel. David, thanks so much for being back with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I think maybe, well, I know today the sort of pro-Netanyahu, pro-judicial overhaul people are on the streets saying they're second-class citizens, which was interesting. But, this comes after this big ruction. So where are we right now in this judicial overhaul scenario here? I mean, it was being reported yesterday in America that things are now kind of slowing down. What's the scene there?
Mm-hmm. It's really frustrating because since Netanyahu is a pathological liar, he knows that all he needs to say is, "Oh, I'm backing down," and then everyone will just run with that headline, and then we'll just want hear what happens next, which was immediately afterwards, he just kept proceeding with the legislative, bulldozing through the legislature all these laws that he wants to pass in order to neuter the judiciary. So nothing is really changing. Everything is still proceeding. The only thing he said is, we're going to put it on pause for 1 month. And in exchange for that 1 month pause, the government has agreed to give Itamar Ben-Gvir, the head of the Kahanist party, the reformed terrorist, has agreed to give him his own private armed militia on top of the police services that he already controls. So I don't know why this is a reason for celebration. And that's why, the protests are continuing. Okay, true enough, the more conservative elements of society that participated only at the very last moment, like the unions and some of the other more, McDonald's and other elements that joined the strike at the very, very last minute. Okay, they're backing down, but the hundreds of thousands of people who have come to the streets in for the last 3 months, really, they're not backing down. They're still heading out into the streets tonight and the rest of the week. There are maybe fewer people in the streets tonight just because they're trying to avoid physical clashes. Being in the same place at the same time as the right wing means that there's going to be physical confrontations because the violence will come from the side of the right wing. So people are trying to avoid actual physical fighting. We've seen in the few times that there have been the two sides on the streets at the same time that right-wingers physically attack the left-wingers or the centrists that are protesting in the street. And they're also, of course, attacking journalists as well. So the point is, the protests are proceeding because the judicial overthrow is proceeding. And it's quite scary because they're just driving the nails in. They're just ramping up. They're not backing down in any way.
David, it's interesting. I mean, I'm glad you put it in the context of like right-wingers. Basically, it's basically a fight between right-wingers and then, as you put it, centrists who maybe think that they're left-wingers, but they're not exactly. It's really a fight within Israeli Jewish society for the most part. And what's so interesting about all this is Palestinians are pretty much completely left out of the conversation. It seems as though, there's really people who are angry that now their rights in this country are going to be impacted. What's the conversation like? And of course, I'm speaking to the conversation that we're seeing in the U.S. media about this. The U.S. media is talking about, we need to fight for the soul of Israel. We can't let Israel become authoritarian. Netanyahu's bringing Israel in an authoritarian direction. Of course, while completely ignoring that we're also talking about an apartheid state that is militarily ruling over millions of Palestinians who have no rights. But what's the conversation like inside of Israel? Are Palestinians at all a part of the conversation? Are people making the point that I just made? Or is this strictly an issue between, the right and the centrists inside Israeli Jewish society specifically?
Mm-hmm. Well, today is Land Day, a day that, for decades, Palestinian citizens of Israel specifically, have been protesting for their rights. But of course, for the most part, they are not participating in these protests against the judicial, overhaul or so-called overhaul. And for the sole reason that, yes, they are completely ignoring. In fact, at the very beginning of these protests, 3 months ago, there were efforts by some radical activists in the Jewish camp to introduce to the conversation the issue of Palestinians and how their rights are the ones that are most trampled upon. And of course, if the judiciary is neutered, then they will suffer even more. But of course, when anyone showed up to one of these protests with a Palestinian flag, they were beaten by the other protesters. So very quickly that stopped. Now, I've heard in recent weeks, the attacks against the few people, the scant people who come out with a Palestinian flag, those attacks have stopped. The protesters have learned to make a space for them. And okay, great, that's a very, very low bar. But the point is that they are a minority within a minority within a minority. Very, very few people at these protests are bringing up the issue of Palestinians. For the most part, it's an inter-Jewish conversation. Now, okay, people are going to most often protest for their own interests, and they do have interests here. So let's at least recognize them. The right wing is trying to neuter the judiciary for several reasons. There's, of course, several factions in the government and in society. We've got the right-wing nationalists, and they want both to help their glorious leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, and other ministers in the government who are up on corruption charges. They want to excuse them and allow them to continue. They aren't offended by the corruption, and they revere these leaders, and they want them to be able to continue. So that's one reason. Of course, they also want to eviscerate the judiciary because it sometimes prevents the worst excesses of Israel's racist laws. Of course, in almost every case for decades, the Supreme Court has, been in lockstep with the legislature and with the government, and it's permitted almost every single racist legislative initiative that has been put forth. But, in rare cases, it sometimes, sticks us something in the spoke of the wheel and prevents it from passing and sends it back to the legislature and asks the legislature to, make a few changes so that it won't be overtly, obviously racist. So because of that, the right wants to be able to pass its racist laws without any impediment. It doesn't want to have to wait for a judicial process for that to happen. And so they want it full steam ahead. So that's their reason. And of course, when you go to the theocrats, the religious camp, the ultra-Orthodox parties, they have different interests. Their interest is they want to continue receiving exemptions from the Israeli army, so they don't serve. They also want to continue receiving benefits for not working, but for studying in religious seminaries. And they want there's a new package of legislation that would be kind of like an affirmative action, more like hermitive action, in a sense that they, would not, for affirmative action is a form of legislation which would allow people who are historically marginalized to get jobs and to pick them for the job if they have the same qualifications as someone else for the job, that they would be the first in line. But here we're talking about hermitive action, where people who are paid to not study English, not study math, not study any basic sciences or the things that you need to function in a modern society, but get the job anyway. So be completely hermitive from a hermit in society, but then get the job. And so this new legislation would force all government agencies and all public services to hire them at twice the rate that they exist in society. So these are their reasons. They want money, jobs, and army exemptions. And then, of course, there's the monarchists, the Kahanists, the ultra-racists, that are both nationalist and religious, and their objective is they are trying to create. Of course, they support all these other agendas of ultra-racist laws, but in addition to all that, they are trying to institute a theocracy. They want to eviscerate the judiciary so that the secular legal system can be replaced with a religious legal system, so that the Torah and the Talmud will become the laws of the land. And that's part of the package of laws that they are proposing. So all of these things threaten the secular nationalists from the centrist parties, we can say. So they have serious interests at stake. Okay, for one, they are the largest group of taxpayers. So if the ultra-Orthodox are receiving benefits and not contributing to the Social Security, then these are the people that contribute the most to, the tax base. At the same time, and they're the ones who serve in the army as well. On the other hand, they also see a great threat from the evisceration of the judiciary, because creating a theocracy would actually impair the rights of women, impair the rights of gay and lesbian people. Traditionally, it hasn't been legislation from the Knesset that has protected the rights of these disadvantaged, historically marginalized groups. It's been the judiciary that's done that. So if we now revert to a medieval, racist, sexist, homophobic set of laws from the Talmud, then that means that their rights are going to be severely impaired. So the secular nationalists are also very worried by this judiciary overhaul. And the other thing we have to say, they're also worried about the image of Israel. The Supreme Court allows Israel to say to the world, we are a democracy. Whether it, of course it isn't, we know it isn't, it's an ethnocracy. It privileges Jews over non-Jews, as we said, in a myriad of ways, but at least it allows Israel to claim that it's a democracy. Without, if the judiciary has no teeth, then Israel will not be able to claim that to the world anymore. And what's more, let's look at the signage we see. Okay, so if we go to the actual protests, the anti-government protests, we'll call them, slogan that has continually been used over and over again is Bagatz hu shachpatz. Of course, what that means in Hebrew is the Supreme Court is our bulletproof vest. So what does that mean? They're saying, because the Supreme Court exists, after we serve in the army and commit war crimes and crimes against humanity, we are still able to now go out into the rest of the world and travel to India and go to Thailand and fly to Europe and the United States and all these other countries, and we're not going to be arrested for these crimes that we committed while we were in the Israeli army, because the rest of the world, on account of Israel's judiciary, says, well, we can't try them in the International Criminal Court because we have to respect Israel's court system. It has a court system, so we can count on it to judge its own soldiers, to prosecute them if they commit war crimes. Of course, so that's why they say the Supreme Court is our bulletproof vest. And if the judiciary is neutered, then there's a good chance that Israelis who did commit war crimes while they were in the army will face punishment for them, might be indicted. Just certainly the leaders of Israel's army, there have been efforts to arrest them when they've entered some of these some countries in Europe and across the world. So that would only step up if there is a weakened judiciary in Israel. So the old elite, the secular nationalists from the centrist parties, are on the wane, and on the rise are the new elite, which is of course the right-wing nationalists and the religious and the monarchists, the Kahanists. So that's kind of the characters that play here. Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinians who are not citizens of Israel are completely absent. Sure, there will be a very, very, very small contingent who does speak out, and that's calling for full equality from the river to the sea. Of course, there are Israeli liberals, there are Israeli socialists who are calling for these things, but they are a minority within a minority.
Well, let me ask you this before we let you go, David. I mean, the big sort of thing in the headlines over here is that there could be a civil war. I mean, a lot of very heated rhetoric. I mean, is it likely that this thing could sort of spin out of control and the existence of Israel as we know it could be at risk? I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, look, just a few days ago, what kind of brought this to a head and caused, this kerfuffle that said Netanyahu, on account of it, said, we'll postpone by just 1 month. That was because Israel's defense minister, from his party, who he's appointed, said, well, I don't know, maybe we need to pause, maybe we need to backtrack, maybe we need to think through these reforms. And the reason why he said that is because many people in Israeli society, have started to say, I'm not going to serve in the army anymore. Not because of the oppressive things it does to Palestinians, but because as a form of protest, as a way of rescinding my part of the social contract. If this is how you're going to treat us, and then we're not going to serve the state. And so it wasn't just one or two. It was, across the board, and there were people who serve in very high-ranking and sensitive positions, like airline pilots and intelligence services and the military. And so when you have this level of people participating in the protest and saying we're not going to show up for reserve duty, then the defense minister is the first to say, wow, I need to protect Israel's security, and I can't do that if I don't have my top soldiers. And that's why he started expressing hesitance about, ramming through this legislation. And so at that point, Netanyahu allegedly fired him. Of course, he still hasn't officially fired him, but that's kind of what set off this whole pause for 1 month. But the point is, it's he's pointing to something very very real, like that. As I said, the security discourse is the main discourse in Israeli society, right? That's why it's about the Supreme Court is our bulletproof vest. And so it's the same thing in the government. It's if there's a threat that there won't be a strong army, then we need to reanalyze things. And so is there possible that we could see a civil war in Israel? It's already happening. First of all, there's already a civil war, but in the sense that Palestinians are half of the population of the country, or 51% or 52%. And so there's always a war on over 50% of the country's population. But in terms of an inter-Jewish war, yeah, we've already seen it, kind of on a slow burn, and now things are ramping up. I don't think that this government is going to back down. I think it sees this as its opportunity to ensure its rule forever. The next laws that it's going to pass will be even more racist. It's going to, make it ineligible for any Palestinian party to participate in the Knesset. At that point, it'll have a permanent victory. It will never be able to be challenged in the so-called democratic system that only allows Jews and the few Palestinians who remained in Israel who weren't kicked out in 1948 to have voting rights. But without the parties that represent them, it'll be an only Jewish Knesset. And at that point, the right does have a majority. Without the few liberals and centrists in Israeli society seeing Palestinians as their true allies and fighting for their real equal rights, they can't ever retake power. And so if the right doesn't get what it wants, if it isn't able to complete this judiciary, it's going to happen by force. That's the whole reason why Netanyahu is giving not only the police ministry to the Kahanist terrorist Itamar Ben-Gvir, but also giving him now his own private militia, armed militia. That means that the next round of protests, it's not going to be the police who were hesitant to break bones because they saw these people as fellow Jews, fellow Israelis, and they saw Ben-Gvir as kind of forcing his way and kind of like sitting over their shoulder and micromanaging them. Now, in addition to the police, he's going to have his own private KKK to just willy-nilly break bones. And more to the point, the Netanyahu government in recent weeks has all been courting mafia families in Israel. What I said, I know it seems hard to believe, but it's not so odd if we look at the history of some other parts in the world where there were fascist governments in which the government courted private militias and mafia organizations in order to privatize the use of force, and so that they could claim, oh no, it's not the government who are beating up protesters in the streets, it's independent contractors. So I think that we are looking at the tip of a civil war in Israel. I don't think anyone's going to back down because this is the fight between the two elites, between the old elite and the new elite, and it won't end until someone is conquered.
Right.
Well, a lot there, and I appreciate you as always joining us here on the show, David Sheen, and helping us sort through it.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you again.